not April 29th, but we created these slides on April 29th, and this is the second set of the same series of trainings where we'll also discuss what is the sort of difference between lobbying and other sorts of policy engagement. So what we'll do is we'll get started today on the policy process, and I'm going to hand it off to Chala to talk a little bit more about the lobbying process. And what is lobbying? What is our role? If you'll click to the next slide, Chala. Okay, so in the policy process of what we'll discuss today, I'll cover a few key words. What are kind of common policy levers? What are the government agencies that often interact with our work? The RPC is largely congressional focused, which at the federal level, we are expanding to the states. So some of this has some implications for other levels of governance, but it is certainly slanted for federal Congress, since that's our primary area of work right now. Yeah, you can go ahead and click through. So starting off with sort of conceptually how the policymaking process works, you guys may notice that we do a lot of rapid response, and that's because we are trying to adapt and respond to policy opportunities. Things move really quickly in the policy arena, and a lot of that is dictated by national mood or the agendas of policymakers. Sometimes there are opportunities that arise because there's sort of the right mix of people in terms of their ideas and ideologies, along with the available solutions that are palatable to them. And so the policymaking process involves really leveraging and those opportunities. And consistent with our use of research evidence literature, where we know that policymakers are most likely to use research whenever it's relevant to the things they're currently working on. They may also use it in the process of persuasion and bargaining, which is really their primary work as legislators, is to get other legislators involved and on board, other stakeholders, make sure that it's sort of a feasible policy to enact. That said, most bills will die in committee. There's a lot of different stages of the policy process, but the committees are very, very important. And their involvement, if you flip to the next slide, I think that shows that little diagram. Yep, so in that diagram here, you see this came from an article that showed like 4% of bills made it out of committee, or 4% were enacted. And it shows the pathways of the first step in the process is referral to committee. And that thick line indicates that most of the bills stopped there. They did not go on to be enacted. The committee is essentially assigned bills based on their jurisdiction. And so that handout actually kind of gives you a little bit more examples of what kinds of committees might be involved in our work. For social sciences, the types of committees that are involved in different issues. It's definitely an oversimplification because committees can take on bills that are sometimes kind of unexpected, slightly, there's times when a bill might be eligible for jurisdiction for one committee or another. And it's actually strategic to try and minimize the likelihood of 2 or more committees working on the same bill at one time, because if they start fighting over it, then there's a lot more people that you have to bargain and negotiate with and come to consensus. And that can be very difficult. I'm sure we even recognize that in the process of consensus building in scientific field is very difficult to come to consensus on things. And so the committee ultimately marks up the bill and writes up a report on sort of like the impact of what the bill would be. And then the goal is to have that bill, if it passes out of committee, ultimately debated by all legislators with a floor action and voted upon. Sometimes it dies there too, because it's up to the leadership of the chamber, House or Senate, to decide whether or not they allow for that floor action, or if they try to pass it through something called unanimous consent, which happens a lot in the Senate with a lot of our child and family policy bills. This happened, for example, with the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act. There was one senator from Arkansas who said no, and the bill could not move forward because the Senate leader would not make floor time for debate on the bill. And so one senator could say no, even if all the other senators say either yes or abstain from voting, it can hang up the whole bill. But there's a reason they do it that way. It's called hotlining because it can speed up the process to avoid the regular rules of order. It also kind of keeps it out of the fray of the media, which can make things more controversial at times. So in essence, yeah, so I think that's a good segue, Chala, because I just covered one of our key words is this hotlining, debate versus hotlining or unanimous consent. Other things to know are that staff tend to be a lot more accessible during recess because when their boss is in town, they tend to be busy with preparing for any floor votes and debates and things like that. They sponsor or co-sponsor bills. The distinction there is they're a legislative champion, and which of their peers or colleagues can they get to sign onto a bill. Sometimes you have one legislator who's really championing it and others that kind of endorse and sign on as supporters. But the ideal role of the co-sponsor is to get other co-sponsors involved. So I went over the process of committee already as well. I didn't cover the word baked. So when a bill gets written and they have already passed it through committee and they've already done a lot of markup, you'll hear staff say, oh, that legislation is already baked. And that means that there's not a lot of wiggle room in terms of making amendments or changes to it. So at that stage of the policymaking process, you often have staff looking to sort of champion the bill as is, but they don't want to have to kind of circle back and renegotiate bill text and language. They're trying to they see it as low-hanging fruit. Let's move it along as it is. I think that at the stage we are in the current legislative cycle is really a great opportunity for us because currently people are still in very much brainstorming and policy development mode, whereas toward the end of this year and early next year, you're going to start hearing a lot more people say, oh, that legislation is baked, because they're going to start to turn their eye toward elections, which means that they want to enact or pass as much of that low-hanging fruit as possible. And they may not be in the policy development stage as much anymore. That's an overgeneralization. Some people may still be willing to write new bills, but right now we're kind of in a nice part of the policymaking process because we can be part of the discussions where they're sort of thinking about how to solve problems rather than just trying to justify the solutions they've already come up with. So caucuses are different than committees in that those are voluntary and informal. Committees, you're assigned, it's structurally part of the congressional process. Caucuses based on a shared policy interest. They may or may not do much related to the caucus, but you know at least that that's something, an issue that they've endorsed or supported. Whenever a bill gets passed through the House, which often seems to be the case for child and family policies, for some reason the House will pass them first and then the Senate sort of sits with them for a little while. So we see that right now with Violence Against Women's Act and with the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. I think those are both still in committee, which means they're very much not baked yet. But they're working from the House version. The House already even passed their version, so the Senate wants to try and make it as similar as possible because it will make the conferencing process as simple and streamlined as possible. And that just means that they're going to have to ultimately figure out what is one singular text. The House and the Senate can pass different versions, but what is the one that comes into law? What is the one that goes to the president's desk? The omnibus is a process of kind of rolling a lot of bills together. This often happens with budgets. And these last two concepts are budget related, so I'll go into detail on those. Cut go is a rule that I think the Republican majority of 2 Congresses ago enacted or passed this rule of order where you couldn't fund new legislation without figuring out where the money would come from. So you had to cut as you go. I think they have different words for it, but that's one of the commonly used phrases to just indicate that you have to figure out how you cut things. And the irony is that you can't just cut anything in the government. It usually is you need to cut something within that committee's jurisdiction. So if it's a bill that's going through Ways and Means, for example, that's entitlement spending. If they're proposing new programs that fit within that, what are the other programs that Ways and Means has control over that can be cut or minimized to pay for that new law? If you'll click next.
Sorry, I'm trying, but it's...
There we go. All right. The budget becomes a huge issue with the different types of policy levers. And as social scientists who often study programs, we're often talking about programs that would require a budget. There's other angles that we can go about using research as well in terms of accountability and regulation. But when we think about programs, we're often thinking about spending, or we're thinking about how to improve the programs that currently exist. And so I have this donkey and a stick metaphor because your policy levers are kind of like incentives versus, I guess, more forceful punishment type oriented approaches. Where the carrot are these spending. How do you go about incentivizing change through spending, through grant dollars and things like that? The government, I included a link on this page for the National Priorities Project because they do some analysis of the federal budget every year, and that's just sort of a proportion of what you see shows that green section is mandatory spending. The majority of the federal budget is entitlement spending that is mandatory year to year. That's things like Title IV-E, which is helps to fund foster care. It's also Social Security and TANF, for example. Discretionary spending, those are programs that Appropriations Committee has to fund year to year to, and there's a lot more, I guess, discretion over whether or not they fund certain programs year to year. And so a lot of your grant programs end up being discretionary spending. With the other types of ways that research can be used for in-policy process is if you think about from an evaluation or monitoring and reporting standpoint, these are things that we're pretty well equipped to do. Chala and I've had meetings even recently with people on government oversight as an example, and they want to know more information about like what are the ways that Congress can monitor the quality of treatment providers in the opioid epidemic. We're spending a lot of money in the federal government on opioid treatment facilities right now, but they're a little concerned that you might have what is sort of parallel to ambulance chasers in the opioid epidemic who are maybe not high quality providers, but just taking a lot of the grant dollars that are coming through these big federal programs. And so what are the ways that we can get involved in sort of ensuring the quality or improving what we know about the effectiveness of those programs? Regulation also comes into play in terms of, I put safety standards as an example, but I also think that regulations are something that come into play with just the types of programs that get funded if they need to have certain types of reporting requirements or certain types of quality standards. You think about accreditation. So this is actually a huge theme in the adoption space right now, is the extent to which the federal government is requiring certain regulations of adoption agencies. And that's a concern for particularly some conservatives that we've met with who are worried that those regulations are going to minimize the ability of adoption agencies to serve families in international adoptions. You can click. A few government agencies that are relevant to these processes, since we were on a kind of budgeting theme, I'll say that we have the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Management Budget, which does something similar to CBO, but it is for the president's office. So they generally have a bit more sunnier disposition about the economy, so their projections can be a bit different. The Congressional Budget Office is obviously more involved in the legislative process as well. So if there's pending or proposed legislation, the CBO can create a score of what the direct cost of that bill would be estimated to be. And so they do use research to guide those cost estimates. They're generally short time horizon, like within 10 years, what do you expect the government to pay or save from a bill? And they consider savings as well, but they don't consider indirect savings. So for example, with your home visiting programs, you may see that they'll consider savings from reduced emergency room visits, or savings as it relates to infants are less likely to have certain health challenges as it relates to mothers being more likely to take care of themselves in the prenatal period. Those are direct effects that they can assess, but what they would not assess in terms of savings would be later in life outcomes for those children. Are they less likely to use Social Security benefits, for example? Those are considered indirect, and they're also very long term. And so they consider those estimates to be less stable, and it kind of means that one of the perspectives that we can offer as researchers is to break those cost estimates down from our research a little bit further. Social return on investments are compelling, but more compelling when you can break it down, because there's so much that gets said to Congress about how much things are going to save, but it's so different than CBO estimates. It obviously raises some eyebrows and criticism of, where did you get those numbers? And the truth is that a lot of those ROIs also are including savings that aren't accruing necessarily to the federal government. So if we can kind of explain, like, these are the ways that the federal government might save from a program, then it would help the legislator to make more sense out of that justification in the budgeting process, because then they can have a more reasonable sense of what the CBO would score it as. So the Congressional Research Service is another agency that I think is really important to know, because I think the RPC really tries to complement what the CRS does. CRS can respond very quickly and rapidly to synthesizing research evidence as it relates to certain policy initiatives. They do have kind of a backlog of different things that they have to prioritize in terms of what information they synthesize. So they have some capacity limits, but it's definitely a huge resource that Congress often uses to generate research synthesis on their issues. Now, to me, there is a difference between synthesis and availability of information and being able to use it. So the RPC, with the interactions that we try to facilitate, we try to make the information more usable. What are the implications, and how can we learn from this? And that's something that CRS can't do. They have a firewall between CRS and Congress, so they're not able to make recommendations, but they're also not able to really have a dialogue about it. And even if they were, they aren't the people necessarily who have direct experiences on the subject matter. And the types of researchers that we involve are often people who have a bit more hands-on direct experience and can kind of explain what it really looks like in communities, which is pretty compelling because Congress always wants to know, like, what are states doing? How is it working in real life? So anyways, that's sort of how we complement CRS. And sorry, one last thing on that is that the executive branch, of course, is charged with interpreting policies that are enacted by Congress. So the agencies are then charged with creating guidelines, like, for example, grant programs. What are the boundaries to what gets funded? And so they interpret those laws. Now you can click. Okay. So I think about the ways that we get involved as researchers in terms of the policy process. You can think about how things are happening before committee. That's really kind of the policy development stage. And once they're in committee, it's responding to what bill text is already there. So they might require expert testimony as an example, or benefit from dissemination techniques like writing a policy brief or holding a congressional briefing. I think we've even gotten involved after a policy has become law before. The Family First Prevention Services Act had requirements to interpret an evidence basis as it would inform the eligibility of programs to whether or not they qualified to serve children in the child welfare system. And so we were asked by congressional staff if we would generate a response from researchers on their perspective of what those evidence review requirements would be. That was kind of a fun one to kind of be part of the interpretation process. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get involved. Model legislation is another one where I think that there's no such thing as like a copyright of policy, or there's no such thing as plagiarism in policy, because you can copy and paste legislation from state into another state or into the federal government, and that is totally the standard. So they draw from examples of other states, and sometimes we get involved with looking at those example languages because people are kind of wondering, like, how has this been done or enacted in another state? The difference between a briefing and a testimony is that a briefing is a lot less formal. It's generally put on by an outside entity, like an organization, and we have a lot more control over, like, the agenda and the flow. Anyone can attend. It's a public meeting. Testimonies are also public, but they're generally scheduled by the committee, and it's very formal. The witnesses provide official written testimony that goes on the record for Congress indefinitely. And then if you might submit between 10 to 30 pages of written testimony, you have maybe 3 to 5 minutes to have an oral statement. And they hand select the people who they want to provide those witness testimonies because they are such a big deal. So it's a great honor to be trusted with that kind of role. You can click forward. I'll talk more about the policy briefs at the communication session. I'll talk more a bit about how we approach policy briefs and congressional briefings generally, like the ways that we can interpret evidence for non-scientific audiences. So take a pause here. Does anybody have any questions or additional thoughts, maybe experiences related to what I discussed? If you're afraid to speak up, you can also use the chat. I can check that as well. Just let me know if you have any questions or anything like that. So I guess, Chella, the next slide. Yeah, we're going to cover advocacy versus lobbying first. Chella, what I'll do is I'll have you cover the lobbying slides. I can cover the next one, I think, is on inside versus outside techniques.
Okay.
And then I'll hand it off to you. And to be completely honest, I got double booked today, so I'm going to take off for another meeting, and Chella's going to finish up with you guys, and she'll give you guys an update on what kinds of things that we're planning for July and August. But let me go ahead and get you guys started on this advocacy distinction. So with advocacy, you can think about advocacy gets a dirty rap because people assume it's lobbying. So we're going to discuss what that lobbying actually means. But with advocacy, you can think about it in a different sort of way as, are you working with government stakeholders, or are you trying to work on the outside of the system to try and ask the government or coerce officials into following your suggested suggestions? So with the inside, I would say the RPC is more of an inside approach in that we try to adapt and adjust to the prevailing values and priorities of Congress. We're not trying to change their beliefs. We're not rallying against the system. This is much more of a relationship building approach where we consult and offer support as it relates to their existing priorities, values, and beliefs. And we just had a session, I think, 2 weeks ago where we discussed sort of how we navigate when we have boundary values that conflict and how we navigate around those boundaries. So I'm not saying that we address all issues in an unlimited kind of way, but we address the ones that are feasible and recognize that we're probably not going to change someone's dominant value belief structure. Whereas outside efforts are things like you might have advocates come in and ask Congress to do something. This is a pretty dominant model of advocacy, is to ask or lobby and to organize things like petitions or protests. Those are sort of pushing change rather than working with. I say communications are applicable to both because framing and like messaging is really particularly valuable in either context. If you know your audience, that makes your message a lot more compatible for them to understand it and resonate with. And that knowing your audience means knowing their values. Values are very salient to the policy process. So if we understand what those values are, then we can not just be empathetic to the motives that drive change, but also understand what are the sort of realistic policy mechanisms that policymakers might consider as alternatives to the current status quo. Next slide. Yep. Chala, are you good with taking it from here?
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Chala. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, everyone. This is Chala. So we define we view advocacy very broadly, and as Taylor said, it gets a dirty reputation because it's a broad umbrella because it includes different types of activities. It's supporting or defending a cause or an issue, but it can include recommending support of evidence-based prevention programs, but it's include education itself. So education is an unbiased information to general public or public officials, but you can use this unbiased information in supporting or defending an issue, being an advocate for that issue. So, for example, in RPC, we try to be clear with our values. So research on evidence-based prevention programs, the use of research evidence and preventions are two values that guides our work. And actually separating us from being a lobbyist or advocating for a specific cause or an issue. So we are giving information about legislation, merely giving information rather than making a recommendation for an action. And whereas in contrast to education, Lobbying is a lot more specific type of advocacy activity. It seeks to influence the enactment or defeat of pending legislation. It could be like asking a legislator to vote a certain way or push a certain change, like Taylor mentioned, as an outside approach. But we are trying to use education and merely educational or technical assistance as an inside, using an inside approach. So while all lobbying is advocacy, not all advocacy is lobbying. And again, the reason is advocacy is an umbrella term that applies to different kinds of activities in the policy arena. So avoiding this slippery slope of lobbying, it's very it's a sensitive issue. When we look at the lobbying regulations, it drives from the use of certain resources. So we include regulations for 501(c) nonprofits, but they're all federally funded research and government employees. It's almost entirely about the use of research, as I said. So if you're not using resources from a grant, or if you're doing everything voluntarily and everything is like the resources, including your own computer or your own email for travel funding, then you are basically fine and you are not in that slippery slope of lobbying per se. But if you're using grant dollars for any of those things, it's important to be careful to ensure that you are lobbying or not lobbying, because if you're using those institutional resources, if you're not using your institutional resources and if you're volunteering your time, again, it's not considered as a lobbying. When we look at the citizen rights, as a citizen of this country with the First Amendment, you have the right to freedom of speech. So you're allowed to actively participate and advocate with your elected officials when you are not on paid time, or when you are not if you're using your personal and voluntary resources, as I mentioned. And for this part, I know it gets tricky. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask Taylor and me. And we would love to go further in depth and answer your questions. And when we ask, can scientists be advocates? I really like this sentence saying, I shudder when I think about the implications of stripping scientists. Those might know more about some given topic than anyone else of their citizenship. Yes, you are considered as a knowledge source, as an information source. So you definitely can be an advocate, but again, with being cautious about what is lobbying or not. So here we have some examples of lobbying and what's not lobbying. On the left, you will see if you ask a legislator to fund Medicaid, it's lobbying. Or if you ask a group to contract their legislator to fund Medicaid, again, these are lobbying. The differences between these two are just direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. If you're coordinating among others, it is a direct lobbying, or if you're coordinating among others, it's more grassroots, and if you are doing individually by yourself, it could be direct lobbying. And third example is even preparing some persuasive materials encouraging, for example, Medicaid funding could be considered as a lobbying. So if you have a specific ask, it could be lobbying. On the other hand, contacting your legislator to provide information about healthcare issues, updating a group of legislation without a call to action, or preparing nonpartisan analyses regarding healthcare, providing technical assistance on how to best implement a change to Medicaid per request, or giving legislation for using legislation for education purposes, or how to, for example, talking about how to use evidence in law. These are not considered as lobbying because you don't have a specific ask. It is more of educational. You're merely providing information consistent with educational technical assistance approach. So some recommendations, like focus on we want to focus on issues and evidence, merely being an objective source of information. And here, even when you focus on issue and evidence, even we want to be cautious about the word distinction, even whether you should say should versus could, or we should do this, or what is good to do rather than what could be done. It's like this differentiation could be very important to specify yourself being a lobbyist or not. So this is the difference in language, what makes a difference on how strongly you can make a recommendation. Being said that, recommendations are very helpful, and as researchers, they see us as, again, a source of knowledge and point of contact that they can get some information. So we are safest when we provide a range of recommendations rather than specific recommendations. And with these ranging and diversity of recommendations would allow them to see, oh, okay, there are different perspectives here. And as Tim always say, there's always more than one way to cut an apple, or how to use research and evidence in different ways. And these options and choices will highlight to you as a notion of like honest broker, which is again a concept derived from URI literature on how we act as a scientist. Or another recommendation is you can describe legislation objectively rather than objecting your own opinion. So again, being consistent with this educational nature, providing information rather than your opinion-led script. And then fourth one is describing how evidence does or does not align with specific legislation. Could again, another helpful, because there's this fact, there's this legislation, and we are just an honest broker in between, trying to make sense of what is out there and how can we use evidence in improving this legislation. So this slide is kind of the summary of what I've described as do's and don'ts. And for do's, yes, researchers who receive federal grant funding, again, you can share your research and its implications outside academia. You can share best practices and success stories with lawmakers, especially they love these stories, real life stories, and that can make things more concrete, especially in our world, in research world. Some concepts are so abstract. So real life stories are really helpful to visualize things. You can share evidence-based policy approaches or model legislation, like Taylor mentioned, and another way of how researchers can engage. You can make clear as you are speaking as an individual scientist instead of representing an organization. And you can lobby as an individual citizen, it's your right, but on a voluntary basis, so you can call or write your legislator. When we think about don'ts use appropriate funds or resources for lobbying regarding pending or proposed legislation, resolution, appropriation, or measure. Don't use the funds to pressure governmental officials in relation to, again, a pending or proposed legislation. And when supporting activities that take a position, take a stance, pushing a change. So this is kind of a great summary slide of some subtle things that we need to be cautious about. Yes. I know even though it was sensitive, I covered it quickly, but do you have any questions? Anything you would like to discuss? Any comments on these? And again, you can use the chat box to ask any questions, and I will say a little bit. Oh, I received.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah. My name's Camille, and I currently work with a state. Basically, it's the Oregon Alliance to Prevent Suicide, and we've been getting money to help with evaluation activities. But now the Alliance is written into statute, and we're not allowed to lobby anymore. And in the past, we've actually helped propose legislation, and it kind of sounds like that would fall into lobbying. We've kind of been trying to tease apart what is what we've been doing lobbying, and if we can continue to do those things. Is that clear?
Yes. I think when I try to really differentiate, oh, am I lobbying or when I'm trying to be conscious about the language, I think about this slide and this bold. Am I asking something specific or do I have a specific ask? And when you said you helped propose some legislation, yes, that sounded to me like could be lobbying. But again, you were helping with the evaluation activities, so you are actually approaching with an educational lens and giving technical assistance on a specific legislation. So I think I need to know more about to decide whether this was lobbying or not and how to make a distinction. And when I approach your question two different lenses, this may not sound like a lobbying because you are giving technical assistance. Am I making?
And that makes sense. And it's a little tricky too because while we're a research entity, assisting with we're part of the alliance and assisting them, but the question is also kind of geared towards the alliance itself, which includes there's also legislators who are on the alliance. So it's a really kind of weird space that we're sitting in right now. A really nice space to be in because we've been able to be really helpful regarding youth suicide prevention in the state of Oregon. But it's helpful to have that lens. So maybe our educational activities and our evaluation activities can continue, but when we're directly asking for proposed legislation to move forward, that's where we really should draw the line.
Yes, I definitely agree. And I think that's how can you make a distinction between whether how can you be clear about you're not lobbying, you're just simply trying to be and assist the program and enhance the program.
Right. Awesome. Thank you.
Of course, I hope this was helpful. And I've received a question, separating our identities as academics and individual citizens. Yes. So this is one thing I'm also learning, and when how we are as an individual citizen and as an academic. One of the strategy, and I think we can use to make this distinction clear is when you not being opinion led, but always use your language as highlight yourself as a researcher, as a source of knowledge. So provide facts and provide evidence or the information that you gathered from your own research, from your own projects or programs, rather than saying, I think, I believe. Saying, okay, with the programs or the research I have been conducting for many years, I found that, or the results reveal that. It may sound very technical, like we are writing an academic paper, but I think using this language could highlight that actually you are not there to reflect your own opinion. You are there to basically share what is out there because you are the expert, you are the source of information within that specific topic that congressional staffers or Congress is interested in. I hope this answered the question.
Hi, this is Laurel. I also have a question.
Of course.
So this thing about making sure that you're on your own time and your own funds, I'm wondering if is that written down somewhere, or is it kind of open to interpretation? And the reason I ask the question is that I currently work in the home visiting arena, and I'm not directly paid by the federal government. My salary comes from the state, but that money in turn comes from the federal government. So I'm not sure, I guess I'm not sure how far back they follow the money to say, are you on government money or not? Do you know anything about that?
Oh, I'm not sure whether this is written somewhere, but it should be. It's definitely should be, because it's about how those funds are transferred to you and how you use those funds. So I think if you are using the funds that is received by the grant dollars for the program, I think you should be safe if I'm making sense. But I will check with Taylor to see whether this is written somewhere and there's a written document for this making this distinction clear.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Of course.
Hi, Chela, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
This is Rashmi. I finally figured out how to work the microphone.
Oh.
That was my question about the academics and individual citizens. So yeah, I'm still a little bit unclear. I understand about the opinion versus, research, being led by research versus, being led, or leading with your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess so. During our interactions or in any form of communication, aren't we always representing? For instance, I work in a university, so am I not always representing the university, or should I make, some kind of an explicit statement saying, I'm here as an individual researcher, I'm not representing my universities, whatever, is, so that's kind of what I was wondering.
Exactly. So when you are invited and you'll be part of this, our rapid response event in-person meetings as an individual researcher who has experience, interest, or expertise on the topics that congressional staffers are interested in. So even though you're affiliated with a university or affiliated with an organization or a company, you are there, your representation, your existence, due to your knowledge, your insights about the topic. For example, there will be one congressional staffer wants to know more about the adjustment of immigrant children in, let's say, immigrant and refugee children in a new environment. You might talk about some of the factors that are important for their well-being, and this will be research-led. This will be basically an educational information based on the research that you have been doing, rather than your own opinion or your own observations. Being said that, again, real-life stories are still important, make things concrete, as I said, some of the success stories, but you are representing even though you're affiliated with someone, and even though the congressional staffer will know where you're coming from, they will not prioritize that information, and they will see you as a source of contact, source of knowledge, an individual researcher.
Okay, great. That's helpful. Thank you very much.
Of course, I'm glad it was helpful. So if you guys, if anyone has a question, please feel free to still ask or email me and Taylor. And I want to conclude with giving you a little bit of update for our July and August meeting. Now we are feverishly working on pairing researchers and congressional staffers on the topics that they are interested in. So I believe Taylor sent everyone an email about the topics that we are targeting for July and August. And we are now inviting you valuable researchers to come to DC to meet with congressional staffers. We successfully completed one rapid response meeting. That's what we call in-person meetings between researchers and congressional staff last week. And it was very successful because, first of all, for me, the person who's coordinating, it was wonderful to see that it's happening in real life. And researchers engaged with congressional staffers, and staffers were prepared. They were so excited to see researchers. Some of them had like prepared a Word document with questions on it, and they asked very insightful questions. And our researchers were in the room having like this rich, insightful discussions. It was wonderful. And now we are in the process of recruiting researchers for July. It will be between July 1st and July 3rd. And July 2nd will be the day we will have in-person meetings with between researchers and congressional staffers. On July 1st, we will have a prep session, including some of the information you've been receiving in these trainings in the afternoon, and it will be followed by a dinner. And on July 3rd, we will have a debriefing and planning session. And we will replicate this in August 5th. And as you know, RPC, we are doing needs assessment, and we are inviting researchers based on the topics that listed on the email that you have received. So as we go along, now we are focusing on some of the topics that we are focusing on is homelessness, immigration, tribal communities, termination of parental rights, child maltreatment, maternal health, low-income families, and TANF, which is temporary assistance for needy families, all the acronyms that I'm still learning, and poverty, and domestic violence, violence against women, and adoption. And as we move forward, as I'm here based in DC, and I'm conducting some meetings with congressional staffers, and as I move forward, I am hearing their needs and interests, and it's a pleasure for me to connect you with them so that we can close this gap between research and policy. And as we move forward, I will be reaching out to you individually based on your experience, interest. So please feel free to reply to the follow-up email after this training, or the previous email that Taylor sent you, including the list of topics. If you can travel, and if you are willing and available to attend to July 1st to July 3rd, or in August meetings, and I believe dates are in the email, but it's from August 5th to 7th, and the second August date will be August 26th to 28th. We would love to have you here and welcome you to DC. Do you have any questions about this meeting or the topics or comments?
Hi, this is Ann Farrell. Thank you so much. This is a great session.
Yes, hi.
I just sent you an email about the July dates, and I'm not totally sure about what the topics are for the 5th and 7th and 26th to 28th of August.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll try to find those. But I also wanted to ask whether, you know, if I have a colleague who might be a good stand-in, do you want me to refer them to you?
Definitely.
You want to stick with us?
Of course, I would love to connect it to your colleague as well. If you can connect me or him via email,
Okay.
I'd love to. So for us, it's important for our researchers to sign up to our network and participate in our evaluation. So I would love to connect to your colleague and invite RPC. And if we can both travel, that will be the dream.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to have to drop off, but thanks very much for this session.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you for participating, and I hope to meet you in person soon.
Likewise.
So if anyone has not any more questions, I would let all of you go. And thank you for taking your time to join our training. And if you have any questions,